it creates an intense burning sensation. You can't see straight, a lot of tearing, redness, and pain.
If you give a police officer any weapon, and gas is a weapon, there is always a risk that that officer will be tempted to misuse it.
Tear gas is often the thing that makes the freedom of assembly impossible. It also can be used as a tool of repression.
We are seeing countries that are using tear gas in an abusive manner, sometimes even impunity.
If they are firing a projectile, which is a gas canister, it shouldn't be aimed at somebody as a weapon.
Hello and welcome to Live with CorpWatch. What you just watched is a video from Amnesty International explaining what it is like to be tear-gassed and why it has become an instrument of repression. Here to discuss this topic today is Anna Feigenbaum, author of Tear Gas, From the Battlefields of WWI to the Streets of Today, published by Verso Press in 2017. She's Associate Professor in Digital Media and Communication at Bournemouth University in the southwest of England. Anna, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off by talking a little bit about the history of riot control in the United States. That video was about tear gas, but in fact, the origins are in fact, or the weapons, the instruments they use are more than just tear gas. So let's talk a little bit about how that began and how it evolved.
So tear gas, we think, was being experimented with by French police prior to the First World War. French protesters really liked barricades. Police got really stuck in trying to figure out how to do crowd control when protesters were behind barricades. And so tear gas became a kind of idea, we think, at that moment in time. And this was just before the First World War. Then during the First World War, we saw an increase in the experimentation with tear gas as well as other kinds of poisonous gas. And that largely happened because trench warfare created a kind of stalemate where neither side could shoot on each other. So this was a way of getting people out of the trenches, disorienting people, demoralizing people in order to make it easier to kill them. After the war ended, there were all these chemical companies that had invested into research and development. There were all these scientists that had been enlisted. And in the US in particular, 10% of all chemists had been enlisted into the war effort. DuPont Chemical, really, really, really big, powerful companies and powerful money behind this kind of science. And so they didn't just want it to go away. So they tried to come up with these, what they called peacetime uses for wartime technologies. And among other things that came out of that, including the gas chamber, was tear gas, and this idea that tear gas could be used as a means of law enforcement.
So who invented tear gas? Is there and who is the first to use it, or how is it?
Tear gas is an umbrella term that we use to talk about all different kinds of gases that do this kind of, as we saw in the video, this kind of burning, sensory, pain, torture, asphyxiating. It's designed to basically torment the body as much as possible and make someone feel kind of as if they're dying, but then leave as little lasting effect as possible. And I'm sure we'll talk about later some of the problems with the idea that that's what tear gas is. So there are different ones that are invented by different people. The one that we now commonly use, which is CS gas, was invented by two scientists in Middlebury in the 1920s, but actually didn't get picked up and used until the 1950s. The kind that was used in the war doesn't really exist anymore in functional police work. And there's a bit of a debate, was it the French, was it the Germans, was it the Americans? They were all experimenting with it among other countries. So there's sort of multiple inventors of different forms. But what made it popular as a policing technology in the United States was a man named General Amos Fries, who worked at the Chemical Warfare Service. And he donated military samples of tear gas to sort of other war veterans, kind of wartime buddies, who were the founders of the original manufacturing plants in the United States, some of which actually exist still today, some of which patents still belong to those early manufacturers. And so that was a big PR push to take tear gas and to turn it into a major law enforcement and sort of prison guarding technology.
So is it actually legal? Is it legal to use in the United States or anywhere?
So the kind of quick answer to that is that tear gas is legal for law enforcement, but it is actually illegal in warfare. And that's because of the something that's ratified in most currently the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the idea is that in warfare, this would be used offensively in that same way that its origins were for trench warfare. So the idea that it would be used as part of a means of killing people in war, so it has to be banned. Whereas for law enforcement, it's thought to be used in smaller doses and only, quote unquote, defensively. So there's this idea that why it can be an exception is because the police are going to use it differently than the military. And that's important to understand because, of course, real world practice versus what's in that international agreement do not always align. And
it can actually be used if, I have a video here from Human Rights Watch, but it can actually be used to kill people if you want to. It's not...
Exactly. Exactly. And so having this exception that allows police and law enforcement to use a technology that very, very easily, it is a weapon, was designed to be a weapon, and very, very easily can be used as a weapon. And I'm not sure if we can ever really say that it's not a weapon, but, however we classify it, there is definitely a distinction between an offensive use and what we might say is a defensive use. So an offensive use is clearing a street of passive protesters. A defensive use is, say, an armed hostage situation, which is not normally where we're seeing it being used.
So, if I've been tear gassed, and any of you that has watched tear gassing happen on television or in person, you'll notice they fire the canisters up in the sky or above the heads of people, so they'll release this quote unquote gas around you. So I want to show this video because, in fact, in this particular case, they're using it differently. Sorry. So as you saw, what as viewers would see, actually, if some people might be just listening to this, if you were just listening to it, all you heard was some music. But what viewers would have seen is the fact that these security forces were actually taking direct aim at protesters, in which case these metal canisters can hit you and they travel at very high speed and they can kill you. That's actually happened according to Human Rights Watch. Let's talk a bit about who it is that's been making this tear gas, the various forms of tear gas, because as you pointed, there are many kinds of tear gas and many manufacturers. So at least in the United States and around the world, who are the big companies that produce this?
Yeah, so my dog's freaking out a bit, so if I might have to let him out in a minute, so apologies.
Sure.
Yeah, so the main manufacturers of tear gas in the United States are Combined Systems, Inc., which is run out of Jamestown, Pennsylvania. They are one of the major international exporters, so we see a lot of their products turn up in the Middle East. They had a big contract with the Israeli forces, and they also supply across the United States. All tear gas manufacturers are relatively small and compared to other kinds of weapons producers, and these are much cheaper items than other kinds of, so we're not talking about big sales figures or big teams. And so Combined Systems as a big player is actually still comparatively quite small. Another one of the really big ones in the United States is Safariland, which is run by Warren Kanders, who some people might know from the Kanders Must Go campaign at the Whitney Museum. He's currently trying to devolve his interest in tear gas. because of the kind of big kind of anti-corporate boycotts and campaigns to push him out that have happened because of his associations to tear gas. But they remain one of the largest US suppliers. There's also a company called Non-Lethal Technologies that's fairly large in the US. And what we've seen really rise to sort of riot control fame in this round of protests is Pepperball, which is a manufacturer that specializes in making these things called pepper balls, which look like paint guns, and they're modeled after paintball guns. And they shoot these little balls that can be made of different materials and filled with different materials. So they include CS, which is a form of tear gas, OC, which is a form of pepper spray, but very similar to tear gas, as well as other kinds of marking agents and irritants, smoke sometimes. And then we also have big suppliers like Mace, which is a particular kind of brand of sprays that we see still quite commonly. Those are the main products that we'll find or we'll see in the US turn up.
And I'm not sure if you've tracked this specifically, because of course you were in England at the time, but the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted after the killing of George Floyd in last month. Well, the protests started really kind of last month and spread across the US. And the New York Times actually documented the use of tear gas in approximately 100 cities. Were there particular companies that stood out, or particular police forces that stood out in terms of how they used these tear gas munitions, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, well, what's going on in Portland right now definitely stands out. The way that police were using these technologies in Seattle, so places where we saw very heated and ongoing interaction. So often we see over time that and we saw this, of course, in Hong Kong, that over time, the escalation and excessive use of tear gas often increases. So when police become more frustrated, more strained, more pulled, more tired, we see increasing sort of excessive and misuse. So often that's going to be centered in cities where the protesters are very perseverant and very resilient. And also Seattle and Portland, importantly, have really strong medic teams, really, really strong abilities to respond to police violence. And that, of course, is going to create a different kind of situation than a city in which this is not normally a weapon that police go to. So different cities are going to have different kinds of police departments. You also have different kinds of tactical squads in different cities. So some cities have tactical squads that are very well trained and very well, like, money's been poured into them and weapons have been poured into them. And other cities where there's a smaller for whatever reasons that are local, there's a smaller tactical team, less resources. It's also important to point out that clip that we opened the show with from Philadelphia, where we see protesters running to try and get away, but they're trapped in a motorway, and so they're running up a hill. But the problem is there's a wall on top of that hill, and so this is an enclosed location. So those kinds of uses are really, really dangerous because there's no escape route. And protocol, or what we call safety guidelines for tear gas, say that you should always both shoot up in the air, as you were just describing, so as not to hit anyone directly with a canister, as well as you should always shoot where there is a way for people to disperse. So this is meant to be, again, a defensive dispersal technology, not a way of trapping people and using it as ammunition against them.
So we have a video from the ACLU explaining the problems with tear gas, but also explaining how the police have used it in Black Lives Matter. So this was shot about a month ago. I'm going to play that because it, I think, puts some of this in context.
Tear gas is considered a chemical weapon. Yes, it's a chemical agent that is banned in warfare, but it has become the first resort weapon to disperse and suppress peaceful protesters with little regulation, accountability, and oversight. We've witnessed police using it excessively against protesters across the United States over the past week, including on journalists.
Police now advancing on protesters. Oh my gosh, we're moving.
Oh!
We're moving.
The most common symptoms of exposure can include excessive tearing and burning of the eyes, a running nose, burning mouth, a chest tightness, coughing, skin burns, nausea, and vomiting. The use of tear gas and other crowd control weapons has been widely condemned as a human rights violations because they have been used indiscriminately, unnecessarily, and often without proper warning and before other less harmful measures were taken. But make no mistake, tear gas and other less lethal weapons are dangerous and shouldn't be used to disperse protesters. Misuse or overuse has led to troubling levels of morbidity and even instances of death. After all, we're still fighting a pandemic, and the use of tear gas in this environment should concern us all. It's time to hold the police accountable for the use of tear gas, and for elected leaders to take steps to ban its use to disperse protesters.
So I was wondering if you could, since as the ACLU says it's time to ask the police to stop using this and to ask politicians to ban the use of these non-lethal or really kind of semi-lethal weapons. What else can people do? You've actually created a little fact sheet for people to understand how these weapons work, how to identify them. Can you talk a bit about this and tell people where to find it, how they can educate themselves about tear gas and what they can do about it, other than, of course, calling the elected representatives and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we created a little fact sheet guide that's up at something called the DART Center, which is a journalism organization. So you can just Google DART Center tear gas, and I'm sure it will show up. We also run a project called Riot ID that you can find on the website, riotid.com, as well as follow us on Twitter at that handle, @RiotID. And that includes a series of infographics and explainers, as well as a board game, for how you can monitor and record the use of less lethal weapons, so both tear gas as well as impact munitions, so things like rubber bullets and sound grenades. And on the Twitter account, what we do is if people tweet us pictures of weapons that they've seen or they found or they want to know what they are, and we work with experts in the field to be able to identify those weapons. And importantly, both the companies, as we were just talking about, but also linked to the companies, is that there's a huge variation of different kinds of weapons. And one of the things that's most challenging, both for journalists reporting on this as well as for people on the street, is knowing what all of these strange looking different kinds of devices are. And so, for example, you have something called a triple chaser grenade that splits into 3 parts. And so people will find on the streets these, see if I have anything a little bit bigger than this, not as happy, that split into these kind of little pieces. And that can be really strange because you're like, wait a second, this isn't a canister. What is this? And why is it smoking? And so that's part of a grenade that stacks up and then the different pieces come apart. So you'll find these little cartridges around. There's also ones that look like balls. I don't have a good ball item around me, but they're about this big, and we've seen lots of those. So they're these little rubber ball grenades that people throw. That's also a really scary thing to all of a sudden see these like ball grenades around you. So just one of the things that's really important is knowing what are these objects, what's inside of these objects, what can these objects do to me, what do I do if I see it on the street next to me or I see it coming at someone. So some of it is just really basic understanding of what these technologies are and how they work against human bodies and what we can do to protect ourselves or treat ourselves after exposure to them. The other thing that I think is really important, and something actually that I've been sort of working with CorpWatch on now for a long time, is trying to insist on naming these corporations, holding the corporations that manufacture these accountable. We saw incredible success with the campaign against Warren Sanders that forced him to resign from the board of the Whitney Museum and now to divest from his Defense Tech tear gas brand. So there's a huge possibility for corporate-based activism against these companies, and something I would really encourage people to do, especially if you're really wanting to know how to get involved and you're not someone for various reasons that can be out on the streets. Corporate activism, boycott campaigns are an excellent way to get involved in this broader campaign around protesters' rights to free speech and assembly. Also, find out and learn about the defund the police movement. We have to go beyond just thinking about tear gas and these weapons and thinking more largely about what we want safety in communities to look like. What are the alternatives? And when people tell us that you have to be tear gassed or you're going to be shot, we need to be able to say things back that say, no, there are all kinds of other ways that we could treat the rights to free speech and assembly and the democratic right to disagree with government corruption, other than by poisoning people with the toxic chemical weapon.
Thank you for that and those amazing suggestions. We'll try and put some of those up on our website at corpwatch.org. But before I leave you, I want you to promote your book. Since you actually have a book on the history of tear gas, I think you should tell people about it, so because they could learn a lot more. They could look up stuff that you've written online, but they can also go out and get the book. So tell us about the book.
Great. So also I'm moving house, so I don't have a copy of the book to show you. But it has a tear gas canister on it. It's from Verso. And it's not that long. And I've been told for a nonfiction book, it's a real page turner. And even a beach read, but I think that depends on what you like to do on the beach. But tear gas covers the history from what I was talking about in the beginning of this program about trench warfare, up through the use of it against colonial independence movements in the 1930s, and then into the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. And then I look at the rise of aerosol and sprays and pepper spray in the 1990s. And then we move into the present and look at its use in the kind of current wave of protests, sort of from kind of Arab uprising times into Occupy, and then into the kind of protest movements from Ferguson, and that's about when the publication date came, a little after Ferguson. It tells a lot of stories about different people that were involved. It's a political economy history, so it tells a lot of stories about corporations and about thinking about both what is a problem between police and protesters, but also about all those behind the scenes things that are going on in governments, in corporations, that are the reason why we've gotten into this place where we use poisonous chemicals as a sort of go-to for crowd control.
And the name of that book again is Tear Gas: From the Battlefields of World War I to the Streets of Today, by Dr. Anna Feigenbaum, who is joining us right now. And it's published by Verso Press. Thank you so much for joining us on Live with CorpWatch. And I'll give out that website in case people want to go there directly for the Darts Center thing. It might be a little hard to remember, but we'll put it up on our website. It's dartcenter.org/resources/covering-riot-control-United States. That wasn't easy. So probably better to, we'll send out a link. So don't forget to click the like button below this. And as we end, I'm going to show a longer video from Amnesty for anyone who wants to stick around, which explains a little more about tear gas and the problems with it. So thank you so much, Anna, and we'll just play this last video, and good luck with your work.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Tear gas is one of the most common less lethal weapons in the world. It is widely regarded as safe as a weapon that causes temporary pain and incapacitation, but not actual harm. The truth is more complicated. The most widely used active ingredient in tear gas is CS, a chemical irritant that affects the eyes, lungs, skin, and mucous membranes. But in actual use, tear gas is more than just a single chemical. Here, we take a look at a typical tear gas canister, the 37mm model 3231, made by Combined Systems Incorporated of Pennsylvania. Like a bullet or a shotgun shell, the 3231 cartridge contains a primer, propellant, and a projectile body which contains the CS mixture. When the trigger is pulled, the firing pin strikes and compresses the primer, causing the primer to ignite. The primer, in turn, ignites the propellant, creating a high-pressure volume of propellant gas, which begins to push the projectile down the barrel. In the model 3231, the propellant gas also expands into the projectile itself, where it interacts with the CS mixture and begins a combustion reaction to produce CS smoke. When the projectile leaves the barrel, it is moving fast. Muzzle velocities vary between canisters and launcher systems, but 75 to 150 meters per second is typical. A projectile with a mass of approximately 100 grams traveling at 70 meters per second has enough kinetic energy to cause serious injury or death in the case of a direct hit. This risk is one reason tear gas canisters are never supposed to be fired directly at people. Shorter, flatter trajectories significantly increase the danger of a fatal strike. However, officers in the field ignore this danger all too often. In this video from Caracas, an officer can be seen firing a Venezuelan KVM 324 canister directly at a protester at a low angle of fire. The projectile's entire trajectory is caught on camera. Here, the projectile causes visible damage to the protester's wooden shield. Had the protester been struck directly in the head or chest, serious injury or death would likely have been the result. Even ignoring the risk of a direct hit, the dangers of tear gas itself are often understated. In sufficient concentration, tear gas can create a breathing hazard rather than just a temporary irritation. For example, officers often fire multiple canisters towards the same target in quick succession or even simultaneously. In this video from Hong Kong, we counted at least 6 different weapons being fired in the span of 5 seconds. We then counted at least 15 projectiles visible on the ground, emitting smoke. Satellite imagery of this location in Hong Kong shows that these projectiles were all within a 10-meter radius. From the footage, it is clear that the smoke plumes from the projectiles overlapped significantly, resulting in a large area of concentrated CS smoke. Protesters attempting to disperse from the area may well have been exposed to higher than typical concentrations of CS for longer than typical durations as a result of this excessive deployment. In addition to excessive deployment by officers, environmental factors such as terrain and features of the built environment can also make use of tear gas more dangerous. This video from Philadelphia shows police firing tear gas into a crowd of protesters on an urban freeway embankment. As canisters land in the middle of the crowd, the protesters have nowhere to go. The steep embankment, surrounded by high fencing, restricts the crowd's ability to disperse, significantly increasing the risk of more serious and long-lasting health effects from prolonged exposure. Cases like these continue to become more common and widespread as tear gas becomes a standard police response to civil disturbance worldwide. Our conclusion is that in such instances, the use of tear gas constitutes torture or other ill treatment under international law.